the life and character in the Gospels. Certainly not the fishermen of Galilee.
Glorifying God, proclaiming truth, and reclaiming America for Christ. This is Truths That Transform. Your host is Dr. D. James Kennedy, pastor of the Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church and president of Coral Ridge Ministries. Discover how to apply biblical principles and transform your world through Jesus Christ. Pure fiction. That's a label that many skeptics love to slap on the accounts of Jesus' life found in the New Testament. But what if I told you the statement you heard from Dr. Kennedy at the start of today's program was actually a statement from a longtime skeptic of Christianity? That's right, it was John Stuart Mill, a 19th century philosopher who attacked the Christian faith for most of his adult life. He later concluded that no mere man could have invented Jesus Christ. Today, in part 2 of Dr. Kennedy's message, Jesus Christ, Myth or Messiah, you'll hear from other former antagonists who realize the error of their ways. This message will also come in handy if you're ever up against skeptics of Christianity. And after hearing it, you'll be even more convinced of the Bible's historical accuracy. So without further ado, here now is Dr. Kennedy.
Jesus Christ, myth or Messiah? Did he ever actually live, or is he simply a cunningly devised myth, a fable, a fairy tale, as occasionally some of the less learned skeptics and atheists are still wont to say? Let me call your attention to the most famous of the Jewish historians, Josephus. He lived in the second half of the 1st century. He was a contemporary with Peter and Paul and John. In his Antiquity of the Jews, this most famous historian of the Jews of the 1st century, in Book 18, Chapter 3, Section 3, makes this famous statement, quote, "About this time lived Jesus, a wise man, if it be proper to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ, O Christos hutas ein. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the instigation of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared unto them again alive on the 3rd day. The divine prophets having foretold these and many other things concerning him, and the sect of the Christians, so named after him, are not extinct to this day." Now, this is a passage which was virtually unanimously accepted down through many centuries until recent times, when it was rejected by radical unbelievers of different types. And they said this is obviously an interpolation. Well, is it obviously an interpolation? Note the facts. Fact number 1, that this paragraph exists in every printed copy, and it exists in every single manuscript of the writings of Josephus known to man. And if anyone decides to take it out, he does it without any internal evidence at all, but only on the basis of his own prejudice that he does not want to have it in there. Another Jewish testimony to Christ is taken from the Talmud, the writings of the Jewish rabbis in the second part of the Talmud, called the Gemara. There is a discussion of Christ. It is a discussion that is made with a most malignant and hostile spirit. There is not one good thing which is said about Jesus, unlike Josephus, who says many good things about him. And you'll find also that history proves that virtually every single antagonist to Jesus Christ has started out writing all sorts of opprobrium against him and ended up writing some of the most glorious praise that we have in history. I will refer to that later. But in the Gemara, we find that there are allusions to the fact that Jesus was an illegitimate son of Mary, that he learned magical arts in Egypt. He practiced them in Palestine. He performed miracles by evil spirits. And for the seducing and instigating of the Israelite people, he was crucified on the day before the Passover. Now, in spite of the fact that this was an effort to demolish and destroy Christ, it in effect gives us a very ancient confirmation of the basic facts of Christ's life, of his unusual birth to Mary, of his practicing of so-called magical arts, of his trip to Egypt, of his ministry in Palestine, of his performing of miracles, albeit by evil spirits, of his instigating the Israelite people, and of his being crucified on the very day before the Passover, just as the Gospel speaks. And so we see that the basic facts narrated in the Gospel of the life of Christ are confirmed by a most hostile source. May I say that this in itself, the Gemara of the Talmud, is in itself enough to completely prove the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. Well, let's move beyond Jewish sources. We've looked at the Christian scriptures and Jewish sources. Now let's look at the heathen. We're told sometime that none of the early heathen writers mentioned Christ or Christianity, that this was something that was totally passed by. Well, again, that's true, that the heathen writers didn't, except for the following: Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, Epictetus, Lucian, Aristides, Galenius, Lampridius, Dio-Cassius, Hymerius, Libanius, Ammianus Marcellinus, Eunapius, and Zosimus. And whole works were written against Christ and Christianity by Celsus, Lucian, Porphyry, Hierocles, and Julian the Apostate. But let's look at just one of them, and that is Tacitus. Now, Tacitus was to the Romans what Josephus was to the Jews, and I think it's very important for you to remember that. Tacitus was the most important pagan historian of the first century, just as Josephus was the most important Jewish historian of the first century. And in the writings of Tacitus, he is describing in one place the persecution of the Christians at Rome by Nero in 64 AD. And in that discussion, we find that he alludes to the following facts. He makes references to the fact that Jesus Christ was put to death as a malefactor by Pontius Pilate. This is a first century Roman historian. This was done in the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and that this same Christ was the founder of the sect known as Christians, and that this latter sect arose in the region of Judea, and that now had spread throughout the entire Roman Empire in spite of the ignominious death of its founder and the contempt and persecution that it had met everywhere that it went. And as early as 64 AD in the city of Rome, a, quote, vast multitude of Christians were most cruelly put to death by Nero.